IVM.
I think I am the only wretched man in the Middle East who has been away from home so long without leave. I dreamed and dreamed of getting back to India and also believed it would come true. But the dream ended in nothing more than a dream. My hopes are shattered to pieces and I feel extremely disappointed.
Hi, I'm Hamsini Hariharan, and you're listening to States of Anarchy. Every week on the show, I speak to experts about global affairs and foreign policy, all in the hope of making a little more sense of the world. What you just heard at the beginning of the episode is a letter that a Havildar clerk wrote from the front in the Middle East in November 1943. What is an Indian Havildar clerk doing there, I hear you ask? This man, along with 25 lakh British Indians, were on the front lines of World War II, fighting the Axis powers. 75 years ago, in September 1945, World War II officially ended, and people around the world continue to remember the event that's changed the world system as we know it. Even though Indian soldiers made up the largest contingent of volunteer fighters, our national history ignores them in favor of the freedom movement. But this is a part of historical experience that needs to be part of the mainstream. So who are these men who played their part in the Allied war effort to beat the axis of evil? What were their personal experiences as people, far from home, facing racism and colonial prejudice? My guest for today has research that takes us where few people have gone before. Dr. Diya Gupta is a literary and cultural historian who is working on her first book on Indian experiences and the literature of Second World War. She's a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute of English Studies at the University of London and writes extensively on the cultural histories of the British Empire. On today's podcast, we'll dive into India's experience in the Second World War and how that's shaped our own national history. But first, a short break.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another awesome week on the IVM Podcast Network. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Intel, for supporting us. First, right off the bat, want to congratulate Ashton Doctor on celebrating the 300th episode of The Habit Coach. It's a great show. If you haven't been listening to it, listen to it now. And if you listen to it, you can almost go for an entire year with an episode a day. It's really fun. Do definitely check that out. We had Siddharth Roy Kapoor on Gauri Devi Dayal's This Round's on Me. Great conversation over there. Arjun Koladi, the head of sales for Spotify in India, was on Advertising is Dead. Do check that out. Really fun show. Sonali Gupta has been on the network a number of times, was on Uncle Please Sit this week, and she had a great conversation with Joel and Tushar. On Cyrus Says, we had Samit Basu, the author, fantasy author, one of my favorites. Definitely do check that out. It was Utsav Memorial Week this week on the IVM network. He was on Cyrus Says Cock and Bull on Thursday. He was on Litnama and, of course, his own podcast, Postcards from Nowhere. Do check that out. And one last note before we go. IVM Likes is back, and we've been doing a bunch of interesting conversations about different pop culture things that you might want to check out during the pandemic. Do give it a listen. I'm sure you'll enjoy that. And with that, let me get you back to your show.
Hi, Dia. Welcome to States of Anarchy. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a real pleasure.
I think you have one of the most interesting research projects that I've come across, and it's particularly interesting that we're recording this in September, considering the part that India has played in World War II. How did you start about researching letters of soldiers during this time period?
Well, it was a really sort of interesting project because I kind of dove into it with a leap of faith, hoping that there would be all these letters and memoirs and novels and poetry for me to discover, but without really a sense of what might be out there. So I would say the project has been as much about archival work, really getting down and dirty in the archives, digging out material, as it has been about analyzing this material and trying to make meaning out of it. So one of the questions that really kind of obsessed me throughout my research was, what did this war mean for not just Indian soldiers, but Indian civilians? What did it mean for the people of India? And I think just at the outset to clarify, when I say India here, I'm talking about pre-partition India. So this is India, modern day India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan.
I think it's good to make the clarification. Do you refer to it as British India or pre-partition India, or are you fine with either term?
I call it undivided India. I sometimes call it pre-partition India, but just to sort of have that disclaimer that we're talking about wider India in this context.
Yeah, that's good to know. And that's also the term that we'll use for this podcast. So before we dive into the letters, could you just give us sort of a background about what India's role was, in the sense of how many Indian soldiers were involved from undivided India in World War II? What were they doing?
Yeah, so it seems quite extraordinary to me, because I started off my project, like I was saying, not really knowing how much was out there that was written by Indian people who took part in the war. And yet I discovered very quickly that there were 2.5 million men from undivided India who took part in this war. And this is widely regarded as the largest volunteer army in the world. So on one hand, you have this extraordinary level of contribution, and on the other hand, you have this extraordinary level of forgetting, both in modern South Asia as well as in the West. And I think on both sides of the world, you have sort of similar histories of nationalism taking over in post-war times, which results in 2.5 million men's contribution being forgotten.
And during this time, how many of them died? What were the compensations they were offered? How did all of that work?
Yeah, so the figures that I found, they tend to vary a bit, but the casualty figures I found, which is numbers of those killed as well as those injured, is roughly around 90,000. And out of the 2.5 million men, nearly 2 million were classified as combatants, and say 500,000 or so were non-combatants. So, you don't just get soldiers in the army, you get drivers, fitters, clerks, cooks, medical men, engineers, all sorts. The compensation is interesting, and it's a difficult question, I have to say, to answer. And this is largely because, the Second World War ends in 1945. And then, as we know so well in India, we have independence and partition just 2 years afterwards in 1947. And I think because the situation then gets so complicated in terms of India's future and the future of Pakistan and Bangladesh, that really compensation for fighting what now seems like an imperial war is very difficult to kind of figure out. Certainly, there's no sort of pensions lists that I've come across. There doesn't seem to be a measured way of marking out what benefits soldiers received once they came back home. But certainly, I would say that there were plenty of benefits to signing up to war. And maybe we can talk a bit about that. What do you think?
Yes, please go on. It's very striking for me to hear that, there are no pension lists. When I think about how even today, when there are, ceremonies and stuff like that held to commemorate the anniversaries of the war and the ending of the war, you have veterans who come back every year. And so it's very interesting that we don't have such lists. But what were the benefits to signing up to war?
So the benefits were actually really, really wide-ranging. So let me sort of explain here the types of people who were being targeted for this recruitment. So as we know, the Second World War starts off with hostilities in 1939 when Hitler is taking over Poland. And this is actually the point where India is being declared a belligerent. And being declared a belligerent by the then Viceroy of India, who's Lord Linlithgow. And he doesn't consult any of the burgeoning Indian political leadership of the Indian National Congress before taking this decision. So soldiers are just sort of sent off, as it were, as part of the British Expeditionary Force in 1939. But why are soldiers sort of signing up? And I'll give you a sense of numbers. So in 1939, before the recruitment drive is really kicked off, you have about just under, I think, 200,000 men forming the entire army. By the end of the war in 1945, that's exponentially expanded to 2.5 million men. So you can really see that dramatic curve. And benefits were, Well, some of it was targeted at the loyal recruitment grounds of the British, which was tended to be undivided Punjab. So Punjabis formed the backbone of the British Indian Army. And they continued to target their recruitment there. And there were lots of benefits. So, for example, there were land grants. Court cases against soldiers would be dropped if they were serving abroad. There was free schooling offered for their children. And, there was this history of participation in the colonial forces that linked to ideas of being martial in certain ways, of being masculine in certain ways. And these really enforced the recruitment drive. On the other hand, for the first time, this recruitment opened up to other parts of India. And this is primarily because the British were desperate for men. They needed men to fight this war. So areas of India that were previously thought to be unmartial or effeminate, if we like, East India, Bengal, and South India, the province of Madras, became some of the places where you started now getting very high numbers of men signing up for war. And the recruitment tactics there were different. So the war was being advertised as this arena where you could learn a trade, you could learn a skill. Say you could pick up engineering skills, and that would prepare you for a post-war world. So it was benefits in terms of employment, in terms of earning a trade, in terms of a respectable profession.
This is very interesting. I also know that you have some letters here to read out for us. And I'm very interested to see what the letters are like and what they say. Would you be up to reading some excerpts for us?
Yes, absolutely. And I have to say this was sort of one of the jewels in the crown, if you like, of my research, finding these letters. And maybe before I read them out, I'll give you a very brief context as to how these letters have survived today. So basically, when the war was taking place, there were letters being written by Indian soldiers on international battlefronts. And then they were, of course, receiving letters from home. So from villages, from towns in India. And the letters were originally written in a whole variety of Indian languages. So there were letters in Gurmukhi, in Urdu, in Malayalam, in Bengali, in Hindi, in English. But you have then the censorship forces around these letters. So military censors would intercept and read these letters. The main reason behind this being that they wouldn't want, for example, locations of men to be revealed to the enemy. So there was that level of very practical censorship that was going on. But I think more importantly, there was an emotional surveillance going on. So the colonial forces and the colonial censor was tasked with knowing what his men were feeling. This was really important. Feelings were really important in the war. Because you have on one hand, in 1942, the Quit India movement, you have Gandhi and Nehru leading on that. It's the biggest protest against British rules since the mutiny of 1857. And at the same time, you have men signing up from India in this war. So it's really important to see what they feel. So there's a lot of surveillance going on of these letters. And so how they have survived today is that the letters used to be translated into English for this colonial censor. And then the censor would take little excerpts and put it into a fortnightly report. And this report was called the morale report. So basically, how do the men feel? What's going on in their emotional worlds? And so the letters are just this fascinating repository of all sorts of emotions. I mean, on one level they're fascinating, on one level they're also quite frustrating because so much we don't know. Like the names have been anonymized. We don't have the full letters. We don't have the original drafts. So we just have these little excerpts that the censor has picked out. And we know of the letter writers, whatever the censor is telling us, which is often where in India they might be from, what language they're writing in, which battlefront they are at now, and which date, And so it's like it's having these wonderful pieces of a puzzle that you can't quite put together, but the pieces are still really valuable. And I have to say the letters really talk about a wide range of things. So the men, a lot of them have never left India, so going out sometimes to the Middle East, and particularly when they join into Europe, they go to Italy, for example, their reactions to seeing, say, Sicily or to seeing the Italian mainland are really extraordinary. So the letters are a lot about sort of travel and wonder. They're a lot about the hardships in the desert, in the Middle East. They're often about missing home, because they're writing back to their family members. They're saying how much they miss their family members. And they are often about the difficulties of being away from home so much, and we should bear in mind here, like I said before, because the recruitment drive had expanded so much into traditional non-recruitment territory, you have men here who are not hardened soldiers. They're not used to this amount of separation from their loved ones. And that comes through a lot in the letters. So that was perhaps a bit of a long preface, but it kind of puts some of these extracts into a bit more of a context for our listeners.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you told me. That is extremely fascinating. I mean, on one hand, an emotional censor is sort of ingenious, sort of even. But on the other hand, it's also amazing that you have this repository of letters. And I'm just imagining how it would be to read all of this in the original script, because all of this longing for home and these new experiences that Indians possibly didn't have words to put to before.
Exactly.
It's utterly fascinating. So let's dive into the letters. I'm very eager to hear them in their own whatever surviving words.
Yes, precisely that. Yes, however they have survived for us. So I have not found yet, and I'm sure they might exist somewhere, letters from anywhere else other than the Middle East and North African battlefronts. So this is primarily where my stock of letters has come from. So let's sort of begin with my first one. This is by an Indian sepoy. The sepoy, an ordinary soldier. He's not an officer. He's very rank and file. And he is writing from Tunisia, and he's writing in May 1943. And he says, I have written to you many times, but God alone knows why I don't get your letters. You say you write regularly. Letters mean half meetings, and they are a great consolation to us. So, and that's it. So this is one of my favorite letters because, I feel like the sepoy is quite self-conscious about the act of writing, and he's very self-conscious about what a letter might mean. And I love that phrase, letters mean half meetings, You never can meet in full, but you can meet halfway through your words, through this exchange of paper. And I think that's really poetic, in times where it is difficult to kind of recover and analyze what very ordinary people felt in extreme war-like situations. You have something like this coming through. I think it's very significant and very kind of moving.
Yes, I completely agree with you. It is extremely moving, particularly that phrase. And, I think your imagination will easily take you to sort of a setting that is very Bollywoodish, but to someone who existed, in flesh and blood, in very difficult conditions.
That's right. And I think that's quite a lovely way of putting it, actually. These words bring us, I think, to some imagination of the flesh and blood conditions. And this is why I'm so interested in emotions and in recovering emotions during war. So I'll go on to sort of my next letter. This is by an assistant signal master who's writing in Urdu. Obviously, this is the translated letter that survived. And he says, I have written several letters home, but I have not received a reply. It's making me miserable. And then you have other letters in a similar tone. So a sepoy in the Indian Army Police Corps says, I have written to you so many letters, but no reply is being received. It is just enough to drive one mad. Perhaps something is wrong somewhere. So you really see that not hearing from home has quite a deep emotional impact, psychological impact on soldiers who are separated from families. And sort of looking at the historical and political conditions of that time, there could be many reasons why the soldiers weren't receiving replies. And one of those reasons is, of course, that India as a home front, I think we should learn to look at India as a home front for war in the 1940s, was suffering considerable shortages in essential commodities. So there were shortages of kerosene, grain, cloth, paper. And actually, one of the things that was happening is that postage stamps were becoming really expensive and were often just stolen from letters. So, and as we know, if the letter doesn't have a postage stamp, it's not going to reach its intended viewer, its intended reader. So obviously, we are speculating about these particular conditions in relation to these particular letters, but they were taking place in this broader context of general hardship in India.
Mm.
I'll read out a couple more, maybe. So this is a sepoy again in Tunisia, who's part of the artillery brigade, and he is writing home in Urdu again in 1943, and he says, "I cannot come on leave. You have written to me not to care for promotions and to prefer leave. I can get neither promotion nor leave, and I don't want promotion. All I want is leave. I am getting tired." So you see some of the sort of difficulties that soldiers were facing in terms of exhaustion from the levels of, intense fighting against German and Italian forces in the Middle East and North Africa. And sometimes it's just this exhaustion feels like it's almost overwhelming, and all that the letter writer says is something very simple, like, "I am getting tired," or "all I want is leave." But to me, even the simplicity is very telling.
Yes, I think you're right. I think it's you can sense a lot of frustration in this letter, with not only sort of like the larger bureaucracies and the conditions we're in, but also directed at the person on the other side.
Yes, that's very true. Yes, they're getting budget from all sides. Yeah, they're getting a lot of flack from home for not coming back home to maybe sort something out, If you were a man who was the provider in a small family in a village, you'd often be needed back home to, fix the house, fix the roof, take care of ailing parents, maybe take care of this agricultural land, to sort stuff out, And I think once that support disappeared because these men had gone off to war, families were very much saying, "Please come back and help us." I should probably mention at this point that large numbers of recruits, particularly from North India, used to be farmers. So they were sort of farmers turned soldiers, So that kind of puts letters like this into some form of context. Let's go on to another letter. This is another sepoy. I've deliberately chosen a lot of the sepoy letters. I really wanted to give a sense of ordinary Indian voices coming through in this podcast. And he writes, "You write to me so often that things have become very expensive. And you ask me to send you more money and more money. Where can I get money? Why doesn't your land, which supplied us all before all this, produce enough for you to eat something? Work hard on the land. I know what mistake I have committed, but it is too late. It was better if we had all worked on the land. At least we would have lived as before. Now I cannot earn enough grain even to last you 2 months." Okay, so that's where this letter ends. And to me, this is really, really fascinating because it's sort of a first-hand account of some of the difficulties that India was facing at that time, wartime shortages, right? And one of the things that was happening is that the value of money fell massively. And so rates of inflation were ridiculously high. So And you can see some of that reflected in this sepoy, who's clearly the earning person in his family. And he's saying, right, I gave up all this work on the land to get this job to come abroad and serve in this colonial army. But actually, the money I'm earning is not worth what I thought it was going to be. And so when I send it home, it doesn't buy enough grain to feed my family. So it's quite a sophisticated letter, I think, in terms of understanding the economics of his situation. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes we can underplay how much, people who are from rural communities have very sophisticated understandings of economic positions. And for me, I don't think this letter is necessarily a subversive one. Even though he's saying, I know what mistake I have committed, he's clearly saying it's a mistake for me to have signed up. I shouldn't have signed up. I should have stayed at home. I still don't think it's subversive. It's not saying, I'm going to break out of this colonial army and run home. But what it is saying is, I feel really helpless. I feel really, really stuck. I'm here, I'm fighting away, I'm far away. I thought I was going to earn enough to feed you, but I'm finding that I can't. And you see a lot more, as we go into 1943, as we know, that is the year of the Bengal famine, for example. There are a lot more letters that talk about hardship at home and how to cope. How do soldiers cope with this hardship at home?
I think what's striking for me is sort of, you're right, I don't think it is subversive, but there is sort of a lot of regret at being part of this colonial project and not being able to, sort of see the bigger picture before you got entangled into it. And I think, it's talking about grains, but it tells us so much, as you said, about the helplessness of the situation. And so the tone of, do all the letters change, or does it just become more pessimistic in general?
I would say it's fairly mixed, So these are sort of selected extracts I'm reading out where they are talking a lot about hardship and longing and desire for leave and all those sorts of things. But there are plenty of other letters that say that, we're having a jolly good time. We're well looked after. We're well fed. We're better fed abroad by the British than we would be in India right now. There's a lot of letters that say that. And, I think that's perfectly true. I mean, if a lot of men were signing up from India in this war because they knew it would lead to better diets, better health, better nutrition, better medicine, There are statistics that show that quite a large number of recruits were underage, anemic, and, ironically, joining up to fight a war was a way of, improving your health. So there are all sorts of letters that kind of make up this enormous repository. There's hundreds and hundreds of extracts. But certainly in 1943, particularly, we see a flood of letters that talk about hardship. And particularly letters from Bengal talk incessantly about hardship. And this is hopefully at some point my next project when I look at what was it like to witness hunger, and even if you are far away from home, what is it like to hear about hunger that's happening at home?
Yeah, that sounds difficult and good to do a whole new podcast on it.
Yes, exactly.
Do you have more excerpts for us?
I am happy to read out more, but I'm also happy to move on to talk about other things.
Let's do one last tranche and then we'll move on to other things.
Okay, sure. Okay. So this is an Indian sepoy who is writing in 1942 or 43. I'm not clear on the date here. And he says, I've not received any letter either from you or from home for a long time. There are two possible explanations. Either all of you have forgotten me, or due to expensiveness in India, you cannot afford to pay for postage. So this, draws back to what I was saying before about the affordability of postage and of postage stamps being stolen all the time. But I think it's not just a practical thing. He's also very concerned that his family might forget him, that people he thinks he's left behind at home are actually moving on. And I think there is this incredible sense of I don't know what the right term is, possible anxiety, this kind of thread of anxiety that runs through the letters, because the soldiers are very aware that the home that they're going to return to is not going to be the home they left behind. And they know that much, just as their lives are changing, their lives are mobile, they are wandering around the world being part of this colonial army. So the situation at home will not remain static.
Yeah, I think, that letter is very interesting. I'm a big romantic, so I appreciate the distinction between of him saying, I haven't heard from you or from home.
Yeah.
And I'm imagining this extremely young chap, just anxious and afraid that people are going to forget him. And it's sort of heartbreaking in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. It is heartbreaking. And you see a lot of this, it's like he's not sure whether his heart's really broken or not, but he's going to flag it up and say, write to me, goddammit, let me know how you are. And for a whole variety of reasons, that becomes a lot more complicated.
Of course. This is just a question that struck me as we're talking about, 2.5 million recruits. Where are the women in this? Are they at home writing letters that could possibly never be delivered and trying to figure out how to desperately feed the old and the young? Yeah. Or are they also enlisting for translations or other jobs? Where are the women in all of this?
Yeah, that is a great question. So women are highly involved in the whole process. So, one of the things that I want to do in my work is to show that war is not something that is restricted to battlefronts. I think that's a very kind of narrow definition of war, and particularly a war like the Second World War, when, numbers of civilians dead are actually higher than wartime battlefront casualties. It's, what we call a total war, where there's a real blurring of lines between the battlefront and the home front. And it claims casualties on both ends. So women are very much a part of this process. There are women who are being recruited as laborers in India, who are building roads for better transport facilities for war. There are women building aerodromes. They're really doing a lot of the hard graft. There are also, like you say, women who are writing to their loved ones stationed abroad who signed up to war. There are quite a few letters from women that survive in these archives. Whether or not they were writing themselves is difficult to know, because you see, the rates of literacy in India in the 40s under the British were not good. In fact, a large percentage of the soldiers themselves would not have been literate. And certainly if the men were not literate, the women, it was considerably harder for women to be literate. So potentially these women were writing in the sense that they were dictating out what they wanted the letter to contain. And you would have had a scribe in the village, maybe a postmaster, basically somebody who could read and write, who'd be writing this letter for them. And then sending it off. And similarly, if at the other end, the soldier was non-literate too, then somebody within his company or battalion, normally these would be like junior officers, like subedars, would read out this letter for him from his wife. And that kind of brings me to this other point that I think is really fascinating. There's so much left unsaid in these letters. They're hinting at so much, and I think part of that is because they know that this audience is not a private one. If you're a woman in a village writing to your husband, but you're having to dictate out this letter to some, scribe in the village, you're gonna not really talk about intimate things. It's quite difficult to do. And I think similarly, if the soldier at the other end knows that this letter is going to be read out by somebody, in his battalion, he would hope that it didn't contain too many personal details. And of course, the soldiers, and I think indeed the civilians, know that the letters are being intercepted and censored. So while you have this sort of practical mechanism of censoring, you also have a self-censorship, I think, that's going on in the letter writers themselves. They know the audience is not a private one.
Yeah, that's extremely fascinating when you think about, the play of also sort of masculinities and how much you can say about having a horrible time and how much you're choosing to reveal.
I think that's a great point, that conflict with masculinity is certainly there. How much can you say about if you are actually a bit miserable, which is not at all to say that all the letters are sad ones. There are plenty of ones that are saying, we're having great fun. Look at Sicily, isn't it just the most beautiful place? But there are equally letters that talk about homesickness, loneliness, and regret at enlistment, like I read out. Actually, I'm also wondering whether it would be nice for our listeners. I found one love letter, like a proper love letter.
Yes,
all the and considering you're such a romantic, I thought you might enjoy this as well. Shall I read this one out?
Yes, please. As a foreign policy podcast, it's not often that we get to discuss romance or love letters. So
Indeed.
I'm going to use this opportunity to the best possible use.
Fair enough. And perhaps I should say I always think the personal is political anyway, so they are not separate realms for me. So this is what I call the love letter. It's written from Sicily. It's written so this is actually by an Indian officer. It's an Indian lieutenant. And he's writing in Urdu to his beloved in 1943. September 1943, when the Allied Liberation Forces are going into Sicily and then they will head to mainland Italy. And he says, "Here I am penning this to you in the middle of one of the biggest nights in the history of this war. Love, I am sure by the time you receive this letter, you will guess correctly as to where I am. I bet you wouldn't like to stay here a single minute. You would feel that the whole world were shaking with an earthquake, or probably the sky were falling over you. I really wish I could reproduce some of the noises which are going on at present around me. Oh, it's terrible. Yet, in the midst of all this commotion, I sit here on my own kit bag and scribble these few lines to my love, or I do not really know when I will next get the opportunity to write to you." Well, that's the bit I've selected out of the letter.
That's just beautiful, and
isn't it? Yeah.
Although I can only imagine how beautiful that would sound
in the original Urdu as well. This is when I feel. I don't read Urdu. I would absolutely love to read it, but also when I feel like I can see the ghost of this beautiful letter lost somewhere, and it's frustrating and pleasurable at the same time.
Yes, 100%. And with that, I think we should talk a little bit about sort of the conditions that these soldiers are writing from. And we already spoke about how a lot of the times the soldiers were well cared for, a lot of the times they weren't. And most of these letters, you said, are from the Middle East and North Africa.
That's right.
So what were the general conditions? How did they deal with racism is something that I'm very interested in hearing about.
So it's difficult to get, I would say, a sense of, say, racism or prejudice from the letters themselves, okay? And this doesn't mean that it's because it didn't exist. It's because of the nature of letter writing. Like I said, they knew that the letters were being censored by colonial authorities. And they knew that the audience for these letters was not private. So on the whole, I would say, references to politics, to discrimination, are not as many as you might think. Okay. I have to say, I think on the whole, and I'm generalizing here, for what is called as other ranks. So this is rank and file soldiers who are not officers. There's not much complaint in this area, but certainly the British Indian Army is a highly stratified army. It's extremely hierarchical. It is born from a long tradition of having a colonial army, which only ever had British officers in the cream of the elite posts. And they were always, kind of managing men who were Indian. So there was that clear power dynamic that had been established for, a couple of 100 years before. In the Second World War, that's slightly disturbed as well. And this is because from the 30s, there was a big push in India, which was massively reluctantly conceded by the British, that there should be Indian elite officers. And they should be properly trained, and they should also form part of the British Indian Army. So from the 30s, actually, this training begins. It's slow, but there is a sort of gradual influx of Indian officers into the British Indian Army. And again, I think it's the war conditions. 1939 suddenly sees an expansion of Indian officers as well. So their numbers go up significantly too. And there is definitely, and you find these in some of the letters that the British officers are writing, a lot of friction between the Indian officers and the British officers. Because they're sort of in the same space, as it were, they're kind of vying for similar things. Certainly, Indian officers are deeply frustrated that they're not paid the same. Neither are the Indian other ranks, for that matter. If you were a British other rank or an ordinary soldier, you'd get paid more than an Indian ordinary soldier. So, but certainly that's also true with the Indian officers. So there's a real kind of discrimination in terms of pay, discrimination or perceived discrimination even in terms of the types of units that Indian officers were being allocated. So they were very careful to see that the racial hierarchies were not being disturbed. Indian officers were not then managing British other ranks. So, but all this was very palpably felt by Indian officers, So there's a lot of friction, I think, in that space, in that elite space of being an officer. And I think there's quite a bit of discrimination in access to, particular clubs and venues that were whites only and officers only. And Indian officers would often say, well, I'm an officer as well. Why don't I have access to this? So clearly, I think the feelings of racial discrimination come out much more in those types of interactions.
And, this sort of brings me naturally to my next question. Yeah. And I was thinking about sort of the difference between how India's participation in World War I versus World War II. And I guess this would be sort of one glaring difference. Yeah. But what would you think are other differences in the way soldiers participated in both the wars and how they're remembered, maybe?
It's a great question, actually. So just to say that there were Indian officers in the First World War, but they would be non-commissioned. I'm sorry to get technical on this. A non-commissioned officer would be your junior officer. So he might be a viceroy's commissioned officer or a VCO, or he might be a non-commissioned officer like an NCO. So a subedar, that sort of level. But to be a proper commissioned elite officer, that did not exist for Indians in the First World War. But like we discussed, that did then percolate in the Second World War. So you did have emergency King's Indian commissioned officers who were definitely part of the British Indian Army. For me, I think the biggest difference between participation in the First World War by India and participation in the Second is the political difference, So in 1914, when the First World War breaks out, it's a very different political moment for India, particularly in its relationship with the British, You have national leaders like Gandhi who are actively recruiting for the British, for the army, So you have national leaders saying, we're going to take part in this, India should sign up for this war. And I think they're all hoping that there's going to be more concessions at the end of the war. So sort of participation is seen as a way of gaining more freedoms, more political freedoms for India. Now, as we know, after 1918, that doesn't happen. You have 1919, you have the Rowlatt Act, you have Jallianwala Bagh massacre, you have, innocent people being shot, unarmed innocent people being shot by the colonial state. And actually the relationship, I think, between India and Britain in those interwar years really sours. So by the time the Second World War is breaking out in 1939, it's, no nationalist worth his or her salt is going to be recruiting for the British. So that does not happen. And in fact, I think I mentioned this right at the start of our conversation. So Lord Linlithgow, who is the Viceroy of India at that time, just declares that India is a belligerent. There is no consultation with Gandhi or Nehru or any of the other Congress leaders. And troops are sent off. They're sent off to the Middle East. And this causes a lot of problems. So Nehru and Gandhi say this is a massive sticking point, We are not saying we don't want to support the fight against fascism. Nehru particularly, grew up in England. He was extremely anti-fascist. Gandhi too they had no time for someone like Hitler. But they were like, we want to be able to declare this decision ourselves, We want some autonomy over our defense strategies, over our financial strategies, over foreign affairs. And this was completely denied. And so what happens is, as we know very well, if we've grown up in India, the 1942 Quit India movement takes place. But what we perhaps don't know enough is that the Quit India movement arises from a refusal by Congress leaders to say yes to participation in the Second World War. It is born out of wartime conditions. So you have then this, big rebellion against the British. You have all the Congress leaders that are swept aside, shoved off to prison. And then they just, it goes silent. But India doesn't stop participating in the war. That still goes ahead. So I think for me, the huge difference is really in terms of the political moment between the First World War and the Second World War.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point to make, because it's, not only is it about, undivided India complaining about sovereignty, it's India did shoulder a lot of the financial burden. And we know for a fact that Britain could have alleviated a lot of the droughts and the famines that were happening, but they chose not to, so that they would be able to store more grain for other British troops. And I can see why that frustration would come about. And, this also makes me wonder about sort of the legacy of Subhash Chandra Bose and the Azad Hind Fauj, right? And because they're very easily remembered in Indian history and the part that they played, but they must be minuscule compared to this extremely large force that were fighting on the side of the Allies.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point to bring up. I mean, that is also, if we're going to talk about a difference in the political moment between the First World War and the Second World War, absolutely, the Azad Hind Fauj, the Indian National Army, did not exist in the First World War because we were not at that point of trying to break free from British rule, And for me, at least, growing up in India, as you rightly say, we know so much about the Azad Hind Fauj, but we don't always see it as something born out of the Second World War. That's certainly something I didn't grow up learning in school. And it's interesting now to reflect on the fact that the Azad Hind Fauj in East Asia, Southeast Asia, was the numbers of recruits were mainly former prisoners of war of the Japanese. So they were soldiers who'd been fighting for the Allies against the Japanese. They'd been taken prisoner. And then Bose came along and persuaded some of them, I should say, to join his national army. And indeed, this is something that Bose also did in Europe. As we know, there's the Indian Legion in Europe, which is even smaller in number. I think the Indian Legion is maybe about 3,000 or so men. Again, prisoners of war who were recruited by Bose. And the Azad Hind Fauj in Southeast Asia would be about maybe 40,000 men or so. So you really see the difference in numbers here.
Mm-hmm. And, all of this makes me wonder. I'm guessing that the soldiers were sort of separated and had a lot of distance from the political events that are happening at home at the end of the day. So you'd also spoken quite a bit about how, the Indian elites within the British Army had felt sort of keenly some of the discrimination. So how did they grapple with, the Allies' political aims?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. It's not an easy one to answer. Certainly, there's statistics, there's historical evidence showing that, for example, at least a fifth of the Indian elite officers recruited had some sort of connection with nationalism or was friends with or related to someone taking part in nationalist activities, anti-colonial nationalist activities. So they were certainly, extremely politically conscious about what was taking place in their country. I would say again, it's the opinion is very diverse. A lot of Indian officers thought of this as an incredible opportunity to really carve out a place for themselves in the army, to gain experience, to gain exposure, and to battle against, fascist forces. I suspect that some of the others were more retrospect about this. They saw it as a job, but they also thought, let this war be over. Let us, deal with this situation first, and then we can come to deciding what we do about British rule. So, if you like, they saw it as some sort of rite of passage, And certainly, I think, without the Second World War, I don't know if we would have had independence in 1947 for all sorts of reasons. You get a massively weakened Britain, and also you get massive contribution from the empire, the British Empire, to this war. And there have to be those sorts of concessions made and for freedom. And I think this brings me to actually a year that I'm increasingly finding more and more fascinating to read about. And it's not our traditional 1945 end of the war. It's not our conventional 1947 independence, but it's 1946. Very pivotal year, but we don't even know about it really. 1946, that interim year between the end of the war and independence and partition, of course, is a time when you have like rebellion everywhere. It's just basically, you cannot cope with this. So you have the Red Fort trials where the INA men are being held and tried, and they're found guilty. But, there's so much popular support for them. Huge popular support that, the commander of the British Indian Army, General Auchinleck, has to commute the sentences and release the men. And that is, there's posters of them everywhere. People are dancing on the streets with their names. They've really ignited the spark of we want our freedom. And on the other side, you have the Royal Indian Navy's mutiny, if you want to use that word, rebellion. And that too, takes place across different cities, different port cities, and spreads like wildfire. And the two kind of rebellions affect one another. And it makes the British, I think, realize that their control is really beginning to slip.
This makes me wonder two things, right? On one hand, how did this sort of inform their identity, fighting under a colonial power on one hand? And I think, one obvious sort of takeaway would be some of these rebellions and mutinies that you'd mentioned.
Yeah.
But I'm also wondering about, for a lot of people who are coming from Indian villages at that point in time, this must be the first time they're meeting people from outside their village, outside their region, meeting Indians of different backgrounds. And I'm also wondering, from sort of just a military history perspective, how much of undivided India's experience in World War II then affect the militaries of India and Pakistan? Because this is a huge force. And, at the end of it, India and Pakistan also had large armies right at the beginning. So I'm just wondering how all of that plays out.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can answer all of it, but these are all like really sort of really fascinating questions. Certainly, you're very right in that rural men, for the first time, often going abroad, for the first time, meeting Indians from other parts of the country, but also meeting, Europeans, Sicilian villagers, or there are some fantastic archival pictures. I wish if this were a video show, I could show you some of them. Indian soldiers in Cyprus. And clearly, the Cypriot villagers are absolutely thrilled to have these, strange men descend on them with their turbans and their mustaches. And they look like they're having such a good time together, just getting to know each other. So certainly it's a really important moment for that sort of cultural encounter to take place. And I think you get a lot of men who come back who are much more, I was saying earlier that the men knew that the home they had left would never be the one they came back to. But also the men who had left would not be the same men that they once were. And they were often, excited by, the superior quality of agricultural work, machinery, etc., that they had seen being used, or they were enthused by the way in which, villages had hygiene and sanitation planned out. And I think more importantly, they came back with a sense of, political consciousness, of themselves, of having a sense of self-worth in kind of surviving these very difficult years. And maybe a new sense of what their rights could be, in a way that they might not have considered before. So certainly I think it's this participation in the Second World War is absolutely transformative for the whole subcontinent. And it's also extraordinary to me. We haven't looked at this before. But really, it changes their lives. It sounds like such a cliche, but it absolutely changes their lives. With regards to, say, the Indian and Pakistani armies, I am less able to comment on this because I don't actually look. My research doesn't take me to the post-war years. But I do know that the British Indian Army is obviously carved up into the Indian Army and the Pakistani Army. And I think they largely maintain the structures, the colonial structures of the British Indian Army, as far as I'm aware, at least in the initial years. And, it's then quite extraordinary that men who had fought together as part of the Allied forces would then be facing each other in conflict.
I think identity is definitely one part of it. And that makes me wonder, what you said earlier as well, that it's unbelievable that this is when we're first coming up with these narratives. And, I think I often come up against two views of the war. So one is this really Eurocentric, North American-centric version of the war.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the other, I think, because of my time in China, is very East Asian, where you have a lot of countries that went through the experience of being colonized by Japan, which was completely different at the end of the day. And at the end of the day, I think World War II history in India just gets subsumed under the freedom struggle. And even if we're learning about World War II, we're learning about all kinds of battles that happened, but very little about the type of role that we played in them. So, from your research, how do we make these narratives more inclusive, do you think?
Yeah, what a wonderful question. And I cannot agree with you more on the Eurocentrism and US centrism of the war. It's something that deeply frustrates me. So I guess at one level, military historians, and I have to say I'm not one of them. I'm definitely a cultural and literary historian. Military historians have included the imperial troops as part of their research on the Second World War. But this has never, to me, really filtered out into a broader public understanding of this, or filtered into the spaces that I'm interested in, which is literature and culture of war. How do men and women respond in times of violence? Extreme violence. Sometimes, they have no control. Violence that they have no control of. Nobody is choosing to be in this war. And for me, the way of making things more inclusive is exactly what we're doing right now. We're talking in a very kind of informal way, not just in an academic forum or an academic paper or an academic book, about the lives and experiences of people from a British colony who, like it or not, were part of this war. And I think, getting away maybe a little bit from some of these broader ideas of European participation, American participation, East Asian participation, into really looking at, intimacy, subjectivity, lives, experiences, the detail, looking at it in terms of voices and the kind of experiential emotional history is my way, I think, to really get into the heart of understanding or trying to understand what these Indian men and women were really up against. And so I'm very keen always to talk publicly about my work. I do a lot of writing for newspapers and magazines and online forums and podcasts and radio shows to really try and get this word out. But also, I wouldn't have been able to do this if I hadn't buried myself in the archives trying to find this stuff. Because it doesn't exist in the public realm. A lot of the, say, for example, memoirs that I've found, really fascinating accounts. I found a Bengali doctor's memoir that he wrote when he was in the Burma front. But it's out of print. It's written in Bengali. There's no translation. So there are lots of issues of access to this material as well. And somewhere down the line, I would like to publish maybe a translation of it, so that it can reach broader audiences. But I really think there should be a push towards this sort of work. What were they saying themselves about their own lives and experiences? And I think that is a very important way of making this history more inclusive.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think you said it very well in that I think we struggle with Indian culture, particularly now, in a lot of people in feeling sort of nationalistic, and I think this is one area that we've just sort of completely overlooked, and we should be patriotic about it, and we should feel for the men and women who went through this extremely difficult period in history that we ignore, more or less.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And to realize that, this history has long roots. There was 200 years of colonial military service in India. We were a colony. This is what happened. And just to ignore all of that and to focus on a nationalist history, I think, is a very narrow way of viewing our history, our own history, but also our place in the world. There are 2.5 million men from undivided India as part of this war. There's, I think, well over 500,000 men from Africa. There's several thousand West Indian men. So part of this broader culture of a power like Britain really depending on its troops from empire to support itself in the war.
And this makes me wonder, how did you go about researching this project? How many letters are there? What is in these archives that are buried? And how did you go about looking through them?
So the short answer is with a lot of difficulty. I basically sort of narrowed my search down to archives where I knew that there were a lot of materials on India. And I suppose I was also lucky in that I was supported in my travel grants by funds. So I looked at, for example, the British Library's India Office records in the UK, the Imperial War Museums in the UK, which has a fantastic archive of photographs from this time of Indian soldiers. Simply amazing. And they're digitizing more of their records. I think that is so important to give people across the world access to this material. There's the National Archives at Kew in the UK, and there's the National Army Museum here. In India, I found the National Archives in Delhi, very useful. And there's the Netaji Research Bureau in Calcutta. And the National Library in Calcutta was actually a treasure trove of these memoirs. And I was quite, it's like you find, I don't want to say a needle in a haystack. It's something a lot more pleasurable, but it's like finding a jewel amongst all these other papers. You think, this is exactly what I was looking for. So it's born out of a lot of painstaking work in the archives, in digging this material out. And then, of course, that's the start, right? You found this material, but then what are you going to do with it? How are you going to talk about it? How are you going to write about it? So it takes time. It definitely takes time.
Yeah, and I think, you're doing extremely valuable work because this is uncovering so much about our cultural history and world history.
Indeed.
So I'm very glad that you're doing it, and I can't wait to read your book or more of your research.
Yeah.
For people who want to know more about the Indian experience of World War II, what would you suggest? What books would you suggest? What resources are out there that you would recommend they get their hands on?
So I have to say I'm very encouraged now because there's been a recent spate of new books on India and the Second World War. So it's really an exciting time to be working in this area. So one of my favorites is actually not an academic book, but it's a very beautiful one. It's Raghu Karnad's Farthest Field, an Indian story of the Second World War. I recommend that to everybody, even if you don't like war. I mean, who likes war anyway? But, just read about it. It's so incredibly well written. I was really inspired by it. More academic books, I'd say there's an excellent social history of India in the war by Yasmin Khan, which is called The Raj at War. It's brilliant. A more military and political history is Srinath Raghavan's recent book called India's War. There's also, I'm reading this right now and I'm really enjoying it, Anirudh Deshpande's book called Hope and Despair, which is about this year I was talking about, 1946, and the rebellions and mutinies that occurred. And there's been a recent book about Indians in Europe, particularly at Dunkirk, which I thought was really fascinating. That's called The Indian Contingent, The Forgotten Muslim Soldiers of Dunkirk, which is by someone called Guy Bowman, who actually did his PhD at a very similar time to mine and who I know well. And then I really hope at some point I'll be able to say, and you can read my book, which is out, but it's not out yet because I'm still writing it. So,
yeah, well, I hope that you write it quickly with everything. No, but thank you so much for coming on the show today and for doing this research. I think this was possibly one of the most mind-blowing podcasts that I've had this year. And
you're very kind. I'm glad. I'm glad you think that, I always feel really enthusiastic about talking about this work. Maybe another thing I should say that it's not just been archives that I found my material in. People have come to me with memories, their own memories, their family memories. They've given me old photographs of their grandfather. They've given me, some memoir that they read that is now out of print. People have really kind of informed my project. And it makes me think actually, we think this history has been forgotten. And indeed it has been. It's been forgotten publicly. But privately, I think, people have remembered. And I'm trying to kind of resurrect that memory.
Yeah, and I think, it goes back to something that you'd said earlier on the podcast, which is the personal is political, and that it'll always play out at some point.
Yeah.
Yeah, but thank you so much for coming on today again.
Not at all.
That's it for this episode of States of Anarchy. Thank you for staying with us. I've attached Diya's recommendations in the episode bio, so do check those out. If you have any questions or comments, you can reach out to me at Hamsini H on Twitter and at States of Anarchy on Instagram. And every Friday, we organize a mini quiz on our Instagram page. So do come and test out your knowledge of the world. States of Anarchy is supported by the Takshashila Institution and the Independent Public Spirited Media Foundation. And we're extremely grateful to them for their support. We're also grateful to you, dear listener, for tuning in week after week. If you want to help us, please leave us a rating on iTunes so that more people can discover us. You can listen to States of Anarchy not only on the IVM podcast app, but also on Spotify, iTunes, Google Podcasts, Gaana, Savan, and every other podcast app on the face of the earth. We'll be back in a fortnight.
Have you ever wondered how successful people do their thing? How do they navigate the challenges they often face? Are you wondering about the future of restaurants, film, education, technology, and everything else in between? Hi, I'm Gauri Devidayal, best known for being one of the brains behind The Table, an award-winning restaurant in Bombay. One thing my life as a restaurateur has given me is the opportunity to meet with some truly inspiring people, most often just by chatting with strangers at the community table. And that's what this podcast is about. It's about learning the new dimensions of business and understanding how different people swim this sea. It's an opportunity for me to pick their brains and ask them all the questions on my mind, whether it's about learning from their past experiences or talking about future trends. Through their journeys, stories, and insights, I hope you too, like me, will come away inspired and energized. So come, join me every Wednesday with your favorite drink, because this round is on me.
Advertising is dead. Yep, you heard me right. Advertising is dead. We're all in the content business now. Let's not call it news, TV, radio, etc., etc. It's all content, and we're in the middle of this weirdly exciting phase where all the borders and lines that have been drawn over decades has been swept away by this lovely thing called the internet. We're a show where we don't dwell on just the stuff that is now, but rather the wider stuff about advertising, media, content, and the whole goddamn circus surrounding it. Tune in every Tuesday for our weekly unboxing of the mystery box we used to call advertising. I'm Varun Dugirala, co-founder and content chief at The Glitch, and this is my new podcast, Advertising is Dead.